Welcome to the Steelers Breakdown podcast featuring PennLive's Steelers beat reporter, Nick Farabaugh. We are 1 week into the pivotal Pittsburgh offseason, and we seem to have a little more clarity developing on the Steelers quarterback situation. That is, if you believe some of the anonymously sourced reports coming out of Pittsburgh. Supposedly, the Steelers aren't that enamored of the free agency crop headlined by Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins, and Sam Darnold. Tomlin loves himself mobile quarterbacks, and you can see that the mobility factor has been key in the run to the Super Bowl. You have big name guys like Josh Allen and rookies like Jaden Daniels one move away from the big game in New Orleans. But does Justin Fields, who the Steelers supposedly are favoring to re-sign, according to these reports, does he measure up to those elite guys that are one step away from the Super Bowl? Supposedly, again, according to these reports, Tomlin and company like the development that they saw with Fields. But my question is, since he only played those first 6 games and we never really saw him other than limited packages, what development are we speaking of? And Nick, how do you view the quarterback situation in light of all this rumors and speculations that the Steelers are already kind of dismissing this free agency crop? I know you're going to be going to the Senior Bowl next week, and you'll get a look at who Tomlin is looking at down there. But how do you view this quarterback situation first and foremost?
Yeah, we talked about this, right, last week, how the purgatory they're in is not really super breakable this year. It's not. There's
Mhm.
just not a lot of great quarterbacks out there. The free agent period, you could either go with an aging veteran, you can go with an Aaron Rodgers, you can go with a Russell Wilson, you can go with the Kirk Cousins. If they went that route, I feel very confident they would just bring back Russell Wilson. I do. I think familiarity, it makes sense. I think that's what they would go. But I think they want to go young. I think they want to have, they've done this kind of overturned veteran thing before. Ben late in his career, Russ late in his career. I think they're a little bit done with going with the older veterans that might be kind of going to the end of their careers here. And so I think we're going to see someone like a Justin Fields. I think it does make sense. I think the one other option I was thinking of outside of Fields or Wilson was maybe Sam Darnold, and I don't want to disclose that just yet because I don't think that should be closed just yet. I think Darnold with the right price makes some sense for them. If he doesn't want $50 million a year, I think, if there's a team out there that gives him $50 million a year, I would not want to be that team. But if it's more reasonable, I think the Steelers could be players in that market. And so I do think that is an option because he's young still. He's a guy that's coming off his best season. Honestly, his season this year was better than any Justin Fields has had yet in his career. We'll see. But Fields right now is kind of the perfect medium where he is 25. He's got this young upside. You saw positivity from him in those 6 games. And then more importantly, he's a professional about it. And I think he just kind of fits what they want, right? He opens up the QB run game. He fits Arthur Smith a little bit more than Russ does because the Arthur Smith scheme we saw this year wasn't really an Arthur Smith scheme as it usually is. It was very much Russell Wilson's kind of show, right? This was not the same scheme you saw when Ryan Tannehill was quarterbacking the Tennessee Titans with Arthur Smith. And so I think maybe they want to get to that a little bit more. And listen, Justin Fields has very similar issues at times to Russell Wilson. He takes sacks, he doesn't throw over the middle of the field a ton. He struggles against zone coverages at times. But he does bring that quarterback run game element. He brings the threat of his legs in the red zone that we saw a lot in those 6 games, bail the Steelers out when nothing was there. He was able to make things happen. And so he's not going to cost a lot either. I think that's the big thing is you're not spending $30 million to bring Justin Fields back. You might spend, 10 or 12 million instead. Whereas even Darnold in a worst case contract scenario is probably getting a very Baker Mayfield-ish deal, $30 million a year. And that's where I think the Steelers are. They don't want to strap themselves into a bad contract. If Justin Fields is back, it might be 2 years, 24, something like that. 1 year guaranteed they can get out of it the second year. Something like that makes sense. And then if he plays very well and he's the guy, you can extend him, all these things. But I think that is going to be the thing with the Steelers is they're trying to kind of find this cost-effective approach because here's my thing. I think this is a long-term play in some regards. Either Fields is the guy and you have him and you sign him to a new deal after this year. Okay, that's a good outcome. Or I think what you are going to see is the Steelers are going to load up other positions. They're going to fix wide receiver. They're going to fix corner. They're going to load the defensive line up this year. They're going to fix these weak points on the team that are still questions for them. And what they're going to do is they're going to surround Justin Fields with the best situation possible, the best thing that they can do in an effort to try and break that drought, but more importantly, kind of figure this quarterback thing out, right? Because if they don't figure it out this year, they are going to probably set themselves up for what looks like a pretty good 2026 class. It looks like a pretty good quarterback class. Now, we're obviously a year and a half out from 2026 NFL draft, but right now, if you're projecting that out, there are 3, 4, 5 guys potentially that could be legitimate top 15 picks. We're talking like last year where it was Nix, Penix, May, Daniels, Williams. We're talking about a similar crop that could maybe emerge there where you have 5 different guys that could go in the top 15. And so that's what the Steelers are setting themselves up for. Either Fields is the guy or they're going to make a big-time move next year and maybe go up and get that guy. And I think that's going to be the long-term play here. So I think it makes sense because they're in purgatory this year. There's not an easy fix unless we talked about the scenario where maybe a guy becomes available, a veteran that's really good that maybe you don't expect becomes available. Maybe they make that move. But outside of that happening, I do think the Fields part of this makes a lot of sense because either he's the guy and you extend him, or next year's the year. I think you maybe finally make that move up for the quarterback and try and get this thing sorted out.
Interesting. 2026, that has a ring to it. Aren't the Steelers hosting the draft in 2026? Wouldn't that be must-see TV to watch them anoint their next quarterback in that draft? Wow. And if that draft is anything like last year's draft, man, I hope they get the Jaden Daniels that is hidden in that draft because those Commanders and watching that quarterback shine as a rookie and go to the championship game has been unbelievable. Speaking of another highly talented football player, we go to George Pickens. It wouldn't be a podcast without talking about George Pickens, but there's been a lot of news about him, namely coming from Jerry Dulac, who's with the Post-Gazette. He's been there forever. He's said to be wired right in to Rooney himself, the owner, and he reports a lot of stuff that supposedly comes right from Art. And one of the things he's saying is that Pickens is all but done. He will not get that second contract for the Steelers. He's entering the last year of his rookie deal. And the choice quote here that I'm going to quote, the Steelers have learned their lesson about giving second contracts to recalcitrant receivers. That's from Dulac. How do you view that situation? I know you basically were saying the same thing, that you don't think he's getting the second deal. And I was hoping, well, maybe they try to do a prove it year and then maybe reward him after that. But how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, it's going to be all about the reaction to the we're not giving you a second contract. I think that's going to be the thing. It could be a prove it year where he's here on the last year of his deal. But to me, George Pickens is a guy that wants paid. He's a guy that views himself as a top receiver. He's a guy that wants that. And so I very much expect George Pickens to be looking for that deal this year. He feels like he should be paid like a top receiver. He feels like he's played like a top receiver. And I don't think he feels like the surroundings have helped him too much. I think that is another thing. I don't think, I think when he is kind of out there, I kind of agree with them at times because they don't highlight him in the offense enough at times. But this is a guy that to me looks like someone that could be traded. It does. Whether you're talking about the antics that have happened on and off the field at times, the up and down play. We know the talent is absolutely enormous. We know how good he can be. But it's become kind of a scenario where I think the Steelers are growing tired of this cycle. It's become a punchline. A Steelers wide receiver is going to be insane, like in some respects, right? It's become kind of a punchline on the internet almost. I think the Steelers are a little bit tired of it. They traded Deontay Johnson for very similar reasons. We've obviously seen how the Deontay Johnson saga has gone this year. He has been all over the place, got cut by the Ravens because he refused to go in the game, was upset after the Texans won a playoff game because he didn't get targeted enough and then got cut. Steelers are tired of that. I think they're tired of these kind of attitudes at that position. And I don't think Pickens has I think Pickens has a completely different attitude than Deontay in that regard. I just think he's a little bit of a I don't want to call him a nuisance, but I think at times you definitely can see that there's a little weight to what George Pickens does, and it kind of it distracts people, right? And it becomes a little bit of that. And I think the Steelers, if they sign George Pickens, they're gonna have to pay him $27-28 million a year. I mean, it's not a small investment. You're paying him like a wide receiver one. The talent on the field is a wide receiver one. But as we were talking about here as well, the Steelers are in a bad spot at that position. It is the worst position to have these issues with, because George Pickens was the offense at times. I mean, there's no putting it any other way. He was the offense. And so trading your best offensive skill player sounds absolutely insane. It does. And Steelers have to fix that position in order to move. If they want to move him, they have to land a top wide receiver. They have to land a T. Higgins. They have to trade for DK Metcalf. They have to do something like this, right? They have to sign Chris Godwin. They have to do something big. And then even if they do sign T. Higgins and then trade George Pickens, they need another one. They're going to need two if they trade George Pickens, maybe even three wide receivers. So that room could undergo the reshaping we've seen rooms in the past undergo. We've seen the Steelers reshape their offensive line last year, where it was significant, right? Fautanu, McCormick, Frazier, all in. We've seen them reshape the linebacker room the first year of Omar Khan's general manager tenure, where he signed Quan Alexander, Orlando Roberts, and Cole Holcomb. This past year, brought in Peyton Wilson and Patrick Queen. We have seen them under Omar Khan take a room and completely redo it. The quarterback room, right? All three out, Russell Wilson, Justin Fields, Kyle Allen in. They have done this before under Omar Khan, where they take an area of need, completely woodshed it, and just rebuild it from the ground up. That might be what we're looking at here at wide receiver. Now, if George Pickens, they go to him and they say, hey, we're not going to give you a deal, and he said, okay, that's fine, I'll go prove it, he'll stay. That's the scenario. I don't think it's imminent that he's going to be traded, but I think there is a mentality that he has as an alpha wide receiver. He wants the football. I think he's a competitor in that way, but I also think some of the antics over the years, grabbing guys by the face mask, fighting in the end zone on a Hail Mary play, some of the crash outs on the sideline, fighting with fans while they're losing in the season finale. I just think there's certain things that have gotten a little bit murky with him, and so I think his future is much in doubt. And if they're not going to pay him, I think there will be a team out there that will pay him. And I think they can get us a day 2 pick for George Pickens, and that can then parlay itself into whether another draft pick. You could trade that for another area of need, so you could parlay the trade into something else. But they definitely, I think, have to think long and hard about George Pickens' future, and if they want to move him, they better go big game hunting in that position, because you cannot trade George Pickens and do what you did last year, which is trading Deontay Johnson and never replacing him. They never replaced Deontay Johnson. You have to. So not only this offseason are they replacing Deontay Johnson, who they never replaced, they would then have to also replace George Pickens, which is, I think, it's a lot to ask, but there's going to be names out here. I think there's going to be a lot of movement on the wide receiver market. Something I've heard that might be on the table is Courtland Sutton from the Denver Broncos. The Broncos really like some of the young players they have, and Vele and Franklin and Mims and some others in that room. And Courtland Sutton's been wanting a new contract for at least a year and a half. And I think he's going to force that issue again this year. He held out last year. They gave him a little re-up for 1 year, but he might want, $22 million a year. And I don't think the Broncos are going to give him that because they have some really, really good defensive players like Nick Benito and Jonathan Cooper and others that they're going to have to re-sign here sooner rather than later. And so that might be a scenario. The Steelers wanted Courtland Sutton badly last year. He was the one guy they really wanted. And that never happened because the Broncos didn't want to trade him. They wanted him for Bo Nix. This year, now that Nix has kind of settled in, I think that might be an avenue they can go down. And so when we're talking about trades, don't discount, Courtland Sutton. Don't discount a DK Metcalf or someone like that. If the Jets are wanting to move on from Devontae Adams, I'm sure the Steelers are going to be in all those sweepstakes. They are going to go big game hunting at wide receiver, and it's probably going to be in an effort to either make this room really good with George Pickens or to try and give themselves leverage. So if they trade George Pickens, it's not a complete disaster.
Well, I think that is the only prudent thing that they can do. And like you said, it's going to be all modes, free agency, big signing, trade possibility, and maybe even we know they like to find receivers in the second round of the draft. And speaking of that, you still have Roman Wilson sort of hanging around in that room, and we've yet to really see what he can bring to the table too. So that that there's an interesting unknown in that regard too. So that will be interesting to see how that develops. But it sounds like once we see some of these dominoes falling in free agency and trades, we might know what the writing on the wall is for George Pickens.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to kind of see how long that takes. I think at least it's not going to happen until free agency, really the middle of free agency, because we got to see where the Steelers are. That could be a draft day trade. They moved Martavis Bryant on draft day. When I look at things like that, I usually think April-ish is about right. I think of, Stephon Diggs got moved, I believe, in early April. A lot of these top receiver trades that happen in that April mood because they kind of you have to find someone to fit that void, right? The Bills only traded Stephon Diggs after they had signed Curtis Samuel. So they signed somebody. Obviously, they ended up drafted Keon Coleman and then trade for Amari Cooper during the season. They had a step plan where they kind of replaced them 3 tiers. The Steelers are going to have to sign somebody big that they think can at least be the one, whether that's a Godwin, a Higgins, trade for somebody. So it's not going to happen until something falls. You can't trade George Pickens without landing a top guy. And so they kind of have to land a top guy here. They don't have the leverage they had last year in the Ayuk trade where, if the Steelers had put a first round pick on the table in the Brandon Ayuk trade, Brandon Ayuk probably would be a Pittsburgh Steeler. I truly believe that. They had put a first-round pick on the table. He would be a Pittsburgh Steeler. Obviously, they never did. So, the final offer, I think, was a 2 and a 3, and he went back. And so the Steelers this year, to me, unless, they're just not super concerned about George Pickens, in which case all the trade talk is useless. If you're thinking about extending him, you got to get somebody in there because if you go in there with him as wide receiver 1 and really no one there to replace him, he's probably going to hold out in a training camp. You're going to have the saga. You're going to be the Brandon Ayuk of the offseason. I don't know the Steelers necessarily want that at training camp.
No, not after they saw what it was like, how excruciating it was like for the San Fran 49ers. The other thing that we were all girding for in this early offseason were coaching staff changes, and Tomlin hinted that they were coming. And we know the pattern of the Steelers is to not cut a lot of coaches under contract, where Rooney has to pay these guys to sit on their couch. So we knew that there might not be a lot of house cleaning of people who had the contracts. But you had some interesting comments about one guy who is whose deal is up with Pittsburgh that you would like to see the Steelers keep. I'm talking about defensive line coach Carl Dunbar, who obviously coaches Cam Hayward, but also gives pointers to T.J. Watt in his game. Amid this call for some coaching turnover. Why are you and others calling for Dunbar to get another deal with the Steelers? Dunbar.
Yeah, I mean, look at the resume. I think when you look at the one coach who should return, I think it's him. He has not been given the investment that other positions have been given, right? The offensive line's been given so much investment, and they didn't really take a step forward. So I'm okay with Pat Meyer going, for example. But look at the defensive line. Everybody they have drafted has turned into something just about. I think the one miss on his resume in terms of mid-round picks would be DeMarvin Leal. But he's a guy that's kind of played inside, outside, didn't really have a clear spot. But Dunbar's a guy that not only did the interior defensive line, he was also with the outside linebackers. And so when I talk about, development, I'm not just talking about, Keanu Benton, who is a nice player and has developed. I'm talking about Javon Hargrave, because he's been here since 2018. Javon Hargrave became a very dominant force, left the team, became elite. They just didn't have the money to pay him. Under Dunbar's tutelage, that's when the Cam Hayward ascension started. Cam Hayward became elite under Dunbar. He was a good player, but he took his game from here to here with Dunbar as his coach. TJ Watt became an elite player under Dunbar's tutelage. Bud Dupree, how many years was Bud Dupree dormant? Then all of a sudden, Dunbar starts working with him in 2020. Bang, the breakout season for him, right? 2019 and 2020 were the two seasons that he really cracked the code, right, at outside linebacker. Alex Highsmith developed under him. Nick Herbig developing under him. There's just so many examples. When you give him investment in young players, he develops them. Montravius Adams was a practice squad player they signed off a practice squad and is now a legitimately solid backup nose tackle. Isaiah Loudermilk was probably an undraftable prospect for most coming out of Wisconsin, became a rotational defensive lineman. Like, he takes guys and builds them up. That's a good coach. And the defensive line, the Steelers just have not drafted the defensive line very heavily over the past few years, which is kind of crazy considering Stephon Tuitt's retirement. They signed Larry Ogunjobi. He never has really been the same after that severe foot injury he suffered in the end of his Cincinnati tenure. So I look at that and say, okay, well, the one investment was free agency, but it was with a 6-7 year veteran. Those guys aren't necessarily going to take steps up all of a sudden. And so when you look at what he's been given, he has developed players. And so if they are planning to do heavy defensive line investment, which I believe they're going to do, I'm talking 2-3 defensive linemen that are probably going to pop in here. I think Ogunjobi's probably out. I think they're going to sign one or two guys, draft another one or two. It's going to be heavy investment in that, especially because I think right now, if you had to ask me who the first round pick will be, it's going to be a defensive line. That's my prediction this far out. I want the guy that I've seen develop players as second and third rounders into legitimately good players at the head of that, because he has turned guys. Highsmith was a third rounder. Watt was a late first rounder. Hargrave was a third round pick. Benton was a second round pick. I just look at the guys he has his fingerprints all over as a coach. And Carl Dunbar has clearly developed some of the best players on this football team. And so, I know people will point to the run defense and some things that have happened on the defensive line. I don't really think that's his fault necessarily. That's the coordinators, that's Tomlin, and it's the lack of investment as well in the depth of the defensive line from young players. And so I think that's the big thing that I keep coming back to, is saying this guy develops players better than anyone else on the staff. I think it's pretty maybe other than Eddie Faulkner, the running backs coach, who has developed his players very nicely over his tenure. I would say the same thing for Faulkner. Faulkner's contract was up. Faulkner's not going anywhere, and his contract is not up. He re-upped last year. Mm-hmm. But they're going to draft a running back probably in the first 4 rounds of this draft. You want that guy coaching that young guy. I think it's the same thing for Carl Dunbar. I want him coaching that guy. Be the same thing for inside linebackers. Aaron Curry's now been here 3 seasons. All the young guys that go into the inside linebacker room, look at Peyton Wilson. Take a step up. Boom. I look at the coaching in those rooms when I see young guys progress. Those are good assistant coaches. The biggest thing an assistant coach can do is develop talent. And I think Carl Dunbar has done that at a very high level.
Well said, Nick. And certainly, stellar Steelers player development is what we need in other areas of this team and what we can't afford to lose in positions where they're going to be investing in younger players, as you mentioned, on that D line. Turning to another coach and another perplexing early Steelers offseason question mark is, some people in Pittsburgh were scratching their head at the outside interest for head coaching positions in Arthur Smith. Not to say that he's going to get any of these positions, but, he was getting attention and he was getting interviews. And it did spark something of a debate on social media, and it caught my attention. Because the two sides of the debate were framed as this. Perhaps the Steelers' under Smith was not under his full control, some of his proponents said. In other words, was Tomlin pulling strings and directing that Russell Wilson continue to start over Justin Fields? That was one way some of the people arguing over Smith and what kind of job he did in Pittsburgh were framing it. And then another poster on X framed it this way, and I thought it was kind of interesting too, and I just want to get Nick's take on it. Smith got better than he expected, got a better than expected run out of a group that included the worst wide receiver room in the league, and we've talked about that. An O-line starting two rookies and Dan Moore and Broderick Jones, and a has-been and a never was at quarterback before it all caught up to him in the end, those last, 6 games or whatever that losing streak was at the end. So how do you view this Arthur Smith job? I mean, was Tomlin overriding him, or did he get a lot more out of some of the weaker areas of this team that were on offense, as the one poster on X pointed out?
I don't personally see it that way. Listen, I think a lot of the Arthur Smith issues I have this year are him, because he did the same things in Atlanta. So it's very similar. First of all, I think the run game is the biggest indictment on him personally. I understand the passing game limitations. Russell Wilson, this stage in his career, is kind of limited in what you can call. He's a deep ball thrower. He is truly threes and layups. That's what they said on Hard Knocks. That's what he is. Doesn't mean he can't have success at times. We saw him do it, but you don't really have the full cachet of a playbook open with Russell Wilson at this point in his career. So passing game, I understand why that menu was shortened a little bit. The run game, though, with how terribly coordinated they were, missing blocks, that falls on the O-line coach and the OC. You got to fix that. It was a problem all season and never got fixed. Early in the season, I think everyone was like, okay, this is, getting the offense in. It happens. It never got fixed. Because as you saw against, I think the clip that really went viral from the Ravens game was Broderick Jones and Dan Moore both pulling on the same play. That just happens too much. One guy misses a block, should have been a big hitter. I saw that so many times on tape this year. That's his fault. He's got to fix that at some point. The O-line coach isn't fixing it. You as the OC got to step in and fix it. And if you did and it didn't get fixed, again, your fault. I just don't love the schematics either with the team that they had. I think when you had Najee Harris, who is not an outside zone runner at all, he is a guy that should be getting those gap schemes, counter, power, trap, different things like that. And you're not giving him those consistently enough when he was his most efficient at the end of last season due to that. I don't understand that, because we've talked about the schematics of the run game. This is not an outside zone team. They're not built for it. And you can want to run outside zone. That's fine. But if your team's not built to run outside zone, you don't have to run 55% outside zone. That's what the Steelers ran this year. They ran 55% outside zone. Second most in the NFL, only behind Kyle Shanahan, who that's the least surprising statistic you've ever seen. And so the Steelers needed to shift the scheme a little bit. and they needed to get things going. They needed to be better coordinated, and they weren't. And so, even though I think the offensive line certainly was not great at times, just because I don't think the talent was there. I think losing Fautano and Daniels definitely caught up to them. They were just basic things. Sometimes it wasn't them getting pushed off the ball. It was them just outright missing the guy. And when that happens across different players on the offensive line, that's coaching at some point. And so I kind of put the blame there. I do think at times his sequencing of plays made no sense. How many second and long runs did the Steelers have this year? In terms of neutral script, which is, 1st and 10, where they could pass or run the ball, they were heavily run heavy. And at times I just thought they were banging their heads into a wall. And again, we talk about Russell Wilson, being a guy that's kind of a limited player at this point. And I understand you don't want him throwing the rock 40 times a game, but there are some times where you can mix in a screen, you can mix in easy throws that I thought they maybe didn't do enough. And so I thought the scripting of plays at times wasn't good. I thought the usage of personnel is probably the biggest thing that I just didn't like. How many times do we have to see Michael Pruitt, Connor Hayward, and Cordero Patterson? Van Jefferson getting more run over Mike Williams when Mike Williams made more plays than Van Jefferson made all season. These things don't make a ton of sense. The usage of Pat Freiermuth at times, where he just finally at the end of the season, Freiermuth finally started to become a featured part of the offense, but he was like dormant for the first 12 weeks. But then Freiermuth picked up, and all of a sudden Pickens is back from his injury, and then they don't feature George. Like, it makes no sense. They don't feature their top playmakers enough. Even when Warren was out snapping Harris, a lot of the times Warren was just in there to pass protect. How about a screen play? How about getting him on an angle route, a wheel route, something that Jaylen Warren's really good at. If you want to run outside zone, that's the guy you run it with. He's the guy that's fast and quick and is a one-cut back. And so Najee Harris should have been the guy getting the gap runs. He should have been the guy running more of the zone runs. All these things come together. The usage of the personnel at times made no sense. And I think, the play action game was very, very lackluster. And that wasn't all Russell Wilson. A lot of people put that on Russell Wilson, but a lot of the concepts they called, very unimaginative. 2 routes that were very similar. And so I just think, Arthur Smith, man, I think he's just a pretty average OC. Sure, he did a good job at times. I think he did a much better job early in the season with Justin Fields. I think Fields is a more natural fit with what he wants. And I think him and Russ were kind of an odd marriage from the start. I think everybody talked about that last offseason. I wrote about it many times about how I thought that marriage was a little odd. They didn't really – Arthur Smith likes to throw to the middle of the field. He likes the quarterback run game. Russ doesn't really do either of those things anymore at this stage in his career. And so all of that is kind of odd. And this is not an offense that's built to play from behind the sticks, and Russ takes a lot of sacks and a lot of things like that. And the Steelers weren't built to be an outside zone team. It was real odd. It was a real odd marriage. And I think some of that pops up, which is why I'm not calling him a bad OC, because I said all those things. I think he did do some things well. I thought, the drop back passing game was more imaginative than I thought. I thought he did lean into Russell Wilson's strengths, which is what you should do as an offensive coordinator. I thought he helped the offensive line at times in pass pro when they probably should have been cooked more. So I think there are things he does that are positives, but I don't think we can call this a good job.
Great way to keep it real on Arthur Smith, and great analysis on why Steelers might be leaning to Justin Fields as a more natural fit with the coordinator who, by all accounts, is going to be back for the coming season. So we're hoping for much more than the average job that he did this past season in this reuniting him with Fields as the starter for, let's hope, more than just 6 games. Finally, Nick, we know you're going to be off to the Senior Bowl, and we know that Mike Tomlin loves this venue, and he loves getting the close-up look at players and positions of need, and he's not shy about signaling where the Steelers' interest lies. So how are you going to watch Tomlin watching the players down there in Mobile?
I always can tell just from things that I see or I hear down there because, it's a big time conglomeration of agents and um, NFL personnel. So you hear things that the Steelers are maybe interested in. You'll be able to tell where they're looking. I think that's the biggest thing is you look at that. And then I'm also just looking for my own evaluation of the players. Do I like this guy? Do I like that guy? Who's sticking out? You'll see Tomlin go up to guys and outright challenge them at times to do this, to do that. And it definitely, you could see it, right? Where I remember last year at the Senior Bowl, he challenged Roman Wilson and Quinion Mitchell to go up against each other, and they did. And obviously, I think the Steelers were very interested in both of those. They ended up drafting Roman Wilson, obviously. I could just see, guys he challenges, guys that he kind of tries to push buttons on. He did the same thing with Keanu Benton. Obviously, they ended up drafting him. There are things that are tells. Steelers don't really hide their interest very well in some of these guys, and so things like that you'll be watching. But I really I like to watch, how these guys kind of take the coaching. We'll see if the Steelers have a coach down there. They've had coaches the past 3 seasons. They had secondary coach Grady Brown and outside linebackers coach Denzel Martin down there in 2022. That was the year they ended up drafting Joey Porter Jr., Corey Tracy, and Nick Herbig. So that's also a tell. And last year they had assistant offensive line coach Isaac Williams down there. They obviously ended up drafting Fautanu, McCormick, and Frazier. So all I'm saying is if they end up sending a Dunbar down there to be their defensive line coach or a wide receiver coach or whatever down there, keep an eye out. That's a pretty good hint as to who they're kind of looking at and what positions they really want to focus on. They love doing that. So I think that's another tell. And you can kind of see, as Tomlin kind of moves across the field, he concentrates on 2 or 3 positions that he really wants to look at. So that's how you kind of look at it. But they do not hide their intentions. And I think by the end of next week, John, I'll be able to give you some pretty good clarity on some draft happenings where the Steelers are looking. I was very adamant last year, even though they didn't have a center, that they were going to go tackle round 1. As long as someone was there, of course. If there was no one there, then they probably would have gone Graham Barton or something like that. But they ended up getting Fautanu. It felt like a tackle was the pick last year. This year, we'll see where that tide carries us. I think right now I'd lean defensive line, but I think there are 3 very clear positions in corner, receiver, and defensive line that are probably the favorites for them to look at. We'll see which one of those kind of rises above.
All right, Nick, we'll be following your reporting on PennLive and on X for all of your tells that you pick up on at the Senior Bowl. And we'll be joining Nick after Tuesday's practices down in Mobile to get all the latest news of what Tomlin is looking at and any other Steelers coaches that could be down in Mobile as well. So join us next Tuesday as we continue the offseason long analysis for your Pittsburgh Steelers.